She was just a secretary with worn-out shoes and quiet dreams. He was a millionaire CEO with a cold heart and too many closed doors. They weren't supposed to meet, and if they did, nothing was supposed to come of it. But then came a rainy morning, a spilled coffee, a single glance on a cold stairwell, and suddenly, two people from different worlds were thrown into something that looked like a deal, but felt dangerously close to something real. Why would a powerful man offer a fake engagement to a woman he barely knew? What pain was he hiding behind his perfect life? And when love finally knocked on the door, would either of them be brave enough to open it? This isn't a story about grand gestures or fairy tales. It's about the quiet kind of love that builds between laundry loads, misfired recipes, and old houses with lights left on for someone to come home to. Some mornings change your life, but they never look like it at first. They begin with a coffee spill and a bruised ego. The rain had arrived before the light that day. A quiet mist clung to the early morning air in Maple Hollow, softening the edges of the sidewalk and painting the world in faded silver. Grace Whitman pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, balancing her usual morning essentials, one hand gripping a stainless steel travel mug, the other clutched around a leather-bound folder filled with half-typed notes and paper clips clinging to hope. She was late, not catastrophically late, but just enough to raise eyebrows at the front desk. Her boots tapped with increasing urgency along the stone walkway leading up to the Hawthorne & Co. development office. She had walked this path every weekday for 3 weeks now, each day hopeful that this temp job might stretch into something more permanent, something stable, something that wouldn't vanish like the last few opportunities had. But fate had its own rhythm. She reached the steps, barely glancing down. A familiar shortcut taken with morning bravado. She knew these steps were tricky when wet, but her mind was already in the building, rehearsing the apology for being late, adjusting her tone of voice, smoothing her hair in her mind. Then it happened. Her boot slid on the second stone step worn smooth from years of use and now slick with drizzle. Her heel wobbled. She stumbled forward, her body twisting awkwardly, arms flailing, and the coffee, it soared. Grace could only watch in horror as her half-full mug released its contents mid-air. The arc was graceful in a cruel, cinematic way too slow to stop, too fast to comprehend. The coffee landed squarely on the polished shoes of a man she hadn't noticed until it was too late. She hit the last step with a soft thud, catching herself with her knee as papers slipped from under her arm and scattered around her like dry autumn leaves. The man didn't move at first. He stood still, the coffee dripping down the toe of his shoes, now spotted with tan stains. His tailored overcoat, dark and perfectly pressed, had taken a few splashes as well. His scarf, a deep navy wool, hung loose around his neck. His expression, when Grace dared to look up, was unreadable, not furious, not even surprised, just still. She scrambled to her feet, cheeks burning. "I'm so sorry," she breathed, already reaching into her bag for napkins she wasn't sure she had. Her heart thudded with the kind of panic that makes a person talk too fast and feel too small. The man slowly reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a crisp white handkerchief, like something out of an old movie. He crouched slightly to dab the worst of the mess from his shoes with methodical calm. He didn't look up right away. When he did, his gaze met hers directly. His eyes were pale gray, almost cold in the dim morning light. There was no anger in them, but no warmth either. Grace's mouth opened again, words bubbling. It was the rain the steps my shoe must have. The man held up his hand, just a fraction, enough to stop her mid-sentence. His voice was quiet, steady, and sharper than the wind curling through the street. "Next time," he said, brushing the edge of his cuff, "watch where you're going." He turned without another word and climbed the remaining steps, disappearing through the glass door with the kind of presence that left silence in his wake. Grace blinked. Once. Twice. She looked down at her coffee-splattered mug, then at the mess of papers on the ground. A receipt clung to her boot. Her folder had burst open, and one of the more important forms now lay face down in a shallow puddle. Her palms were damp, partly from the mist, partly from sweat. She tried to steady her breathing, but it was useless. Everything had unraveled in under 10 seconds. She knelt to gather the papers, fingers trembling slightly. Her coat had picked up a streak of mud on the sleeve. Her knee throbbed from the stumble, but she ignored it. Inside the building, the warm glow of overhead lights spilled out into the mist, as if inviting her in or warning her to stay away. She took a deep breath, smoothed the front of her coat, and started up the steps again, this time carefully. The receptionist behind the desk, Carol, with her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, offered Grace a small smile as she stepped inside. Grace managed to return it, if only halfway. "Rough morning?" Carol asked gently. Grace gave a soft chuckle that was more exhale than laughter. "You could say that." She glanced around the lobby, trying to shake off the lingering humiliation. It was just a moment, a bad start, nothing more. She'd push through it, like she always did, but something in her lingered on the image of that man, the measured calm, the way he hadn't even flinched. There was something about him. Not just the way he looked or dressed, but the energy he carried. It felt out of place in Maple Hollow, like he belonged to a colder world, sharper and far more distant. Grace told herself to let it go. Accidents happen. People move on. She had a job to do, a desk to reach, a new beginning. She hoped. Still, as she stepped into the elevator, the echo of that single sentence stayed with her. Watch where you're going. She didn't know it yet, but those words weren't just about the steps. There are days when fate isn't subtle. It slaps you with a nameplate. And the memory of spilled coffee. The hallway was warmer than she expected, a stark contrast to the chill clinging to her coat, and the embarrassment still humming beneath her skin. Grace walked with measured steps toward the back office, clutching her folder tighter than necessary, as if the pages inside could anchor her from further humiliation. The morning had already carved its mark into her pride. She just wanted to keep her head down, do her work, and let the incident with the stranger fade into the fog of memory. But fate, as it often did, had other plans. The name on the brass plaque beside the office door stopped her cold. Daniel Hawthorne. Her breath caught. For a second, she thought it was just a coincidence, a name she misread in her flustered state. But then the door opened from the inside, and he stepped out. The man from the steps. The one with the coffee-stained shoes and the cutting voice. Grace instinctively took a half step back, but Daniel barely acknowledged her. He looked over her just once, with a glance so practiced it felt clinical. Then he turned and spoke quietly to Carol at reception, asking for the conference room to be set up for an all-staff meeting. He disappeared down the hall as quickly as he'd come. Grace stood frozen, her mind scrambling to catch up. Daniel Hawthorne, CEO of Hawthorne & Co., Development. Son of Nora Hawthorne, the woman who had practically built Maple Hollow's community spaces brick by brick. He was known in the trade magazines for his high-profile urban renewal projects in New York and Boston. The kind of man who didn't just walk into town, he returned with intent. And apparently, he didn't take kindly to cinnamon lattes on his shoes. Grace let out a slow breath. If he remembered her from this morning, and how could he not, he hadn't shown it. No sneer, no sarcasm, just nothing, which somehow felt worse. The meeting was called for 10 sharp. Grace took her place near the back of the small conference room, heart pounding beneath her cardigan. The rest of the team shuffled in slowly, some veterans of the office, others temporary like her. They whispered to one another, eyes wide with speculation. Daniel entered last. He didn't sit. Instead, he stood at the head of the table, arms relaxed at his sides, gaze level. "I won't take up much of your time," he began, his voice even and unhurried. "This branch has been underperforming for the better part of 2 years. My mother's legacy deserves better." There was a murmur, respectful but cautious. Nora Hawthorne was beloved here. "I've been tasked with evaluating the future of this office, whether it can be saved, restructured, or shuttered. Silence followed. Someone shifted in their chair. A pen clicked. Grace kept her eyes low. Daniel continued. Over the next few weeks, I'll be reviewing everything: processes, personnel, efficiency. Some of you may be reassigned. Some may not be retained. This is not personal. It's business. The air thickened, but, he added, his eyes sweeping the room, I believe in second chances. I also believe in watching closely before making decisions. His gaze flickered to Grace for the briefest moment. She wasn't sure if she imagined it. After the meeting, people lingered in the hallway, exchanging whispers about layoffs and restructuring. Grace returned to her desk and focused on organizing property files, pretending her stomach wasn't knotted. Later that afternoon, she was asked to deliver a folder to the second floor, where Daniel had temporarily taken residence in what used to be Nora's office. She knocked lightly and stepped in. The office had changed little, still lined with oak bookshelves and framed community awards. A portrait of Nora hung near the window, her smile as steady as Grace remembered from town meetings and library fundraisers. Daniel looked up from his laptop. Grace Whitman. Right. She blinked. Yes. Sir? Have a seat. It wasn't a request. Grace sat, clutching the folder like a lifeline. I saw the way you handled Mrs. Dorsey last week, he said without looking up. The elderly woman asking about the zoning change. Grace nodded. She was confused, thought we were tearing down her garden. You calmed her without dismissing her. That's rare in this business. She didn't know what to say. Daniel finally closed his laptop and met her eyes. I need a temporary assistant, someone who can keep things running smoothly while I reorganize this place. Grace's eyebrows rose. I already have a position, she said cautiously. A temporary desk job, he countered. This is more, and short term. You'll be reporting directly to me. She hesitated. It felt too sudden, too pointed. After all, this was the same man she'd spilled coffee on just hours ago. Why me? Because you pay attention, you listen, and you don't talk more than necessary. She wasn't sure if that last part was a compliment. He stood, signaling the conversation was over. You'll start tomorrow. Grace rose slowly, folder still in hand. She didn't say yes, but he seemed to know she would. As she stepped out into the hallway, the door clicked shut behind her. She had come in that morning hoping to make it to Friday without tripping literally or figuratively. Now she was the assistant to a man who didn't blink when faced with chaos. She didn't know it yet, but this job would become the most personal assignment of her life. Some deals aren't made in boardrooms. They're made in quiet offices, with trembling hands and promises too strange to be real. Grace didn't expect to be called into Daniel Hawthorne's office that afternoon. Her schedule was full, mostly with errands he preferred not to delegate to anyone else, calls to contractors, organizing site visits, reviewing dull spreadsheets that seemed to stretch into eternity. He wasn't a difficult boss, just distant and particular, always precise, always watching. When Carol told her, "Mr. Hawthorne wants to see you," Grace assumed it had something to do with a calendar update or another building permit. But the moment she stepped into the office, she sensed something different. Daniel stood by the window, hands in his pockets, looking out over Maple Hollow as if he could see all its secrets through the fall trees. His shoulders were tense, back straight, yet there was a stillness in him that suggested something weighed more than numbers or blueprints. He didn't speak right away. The silence stretched just long enough to be uncomfortable. Grace hovered near the doorway, waiting, finally. He turned, closed the door. She obeyed, heart ticking faster with each step as she crossed the room. He gestured for her to sit, but didn't take his usual seat behind the desk. Instead, he remained standing, eyes fixed on her, not cold, but searching. I have something to ask you, he said, and I want you to hear the full story before you respond. Grace's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the chair. Okay. There's an event next weekend, he began. A charity fundraiser organized in memory of my mother. It's hosted at the town library, something she started years ago. Grace nodded. She remembered the event. Nora Hawthorne had championed it, raising funds to keep the library alive during difficult winters. The press will be there. Some local board members, former donors, people who knew my mother, and expected more from me. His tone dipped slightly on the last part. Regret, bitterness. She couldn't tell. I've been back in Maple Hollow for 3 months now, Daniel continued, and despite my efforts to keep a low profile, my presence has sparked questions about the future of this office, my intentions, my personal life. Grace raised an eyebrow, unsure where this was going. He took a breath. They think I'm unstable, that I live behind walls, that I don't know how to belong here anymore. And they're right, in some ways. Grace's throat tightened. Daniel stepped forward, slowly, his voice calm but focused. So, I'm asking you professionally to help me shift that narrative. She blinked. How he looked her in the eyes. By standing beside me at the fundraiser, as my fiancé. The word dropped between them like a stone in still water. For a moment, Grace thought she'd misheard. She waited for a laugh, a smile, anything to break the strangeness of what had just been said. But Daniel's face didn't change. You're asking me, she said slowly, to pretend to be engaged to you. Yes. She stared at him. Why me? Because you're discreet, he said. You're grounded. People trust you. And you're not from my world, which makes you believable. Her pulse quickened. She wanted to scoff, to tell him how ridiculous it sounded, but something in his expression stopped her. He wasn't playing a game. There's more, he added, and this time, he reached into the drawer behind him and placed a folded paper on the desk between them. It was a hospital invoice. With her brother's name on it, she felt the blood rush from her face. I had Carol do some research. He admitted, not apologetically, but matter-of-factly. Your brother, Ethan, physical therapy costs, medication, a home care nurse. Her jaw tightened. That's none of your business. Maybe not, but I can help, he said simply. If you agree to the arrangement just for the next few weeks, I'll cover the expenses. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air thinner. Grace looked down at her hands, then at the paper, then back at him. She didn't like being cornered, especially not with something so personal. But at the same time, the offer was too precise to ignore. It hit exactly where she was weakest. Still, her pride pushed back. And what exactly do you want this to look like? She asked, voice cool, public appearances. Daniel replied, a believable connection, nothing more. Grace leaned back, her heart and mind pulled in opposite directions, dignity on one end, desperation on the other. Then she said, quietly but firmly, fine. Daniel raised his eyebrows slightly. I'll do it, she clarified, but on one condition. He waited. No emotions, she said, no blurring lines. This stays professional. We act. That's it. Daniel was silent for a moment, as if measuring her. Then, slowly, he nodded, but Grace saw something flicker in his eyes before he turned away. A hesitation, a memory, or maybe a part of him already questioning whether either of them could really keep that line from fading. It wasn't the music that made her heart race. It was the way he looked at her, as if he forgot it was all pretend. The fall fundraiser had always been a quiet kind of elegance in Maple Hollow. No grand chandeliers or velvet ropes. Just string lights across the library lawn, folding chairs in neat rows, and tables lined with warm cider and homemade pies. People came in wool coats and polished boots, bringing their checkbooks and stories, ready to remember Nora Hawthorne and support the legacy she had built. Grace had stood in front of her mirror for almost 15 minutes, second-guessing her dress. It wasn't glamorous, just a simple navy wrap dress that caught the light in all the right places, paired with modest heels and a silver necklace that had once belonged to her mother. She wanted to look the part, not overdone, not invisible, just believable. The cool air met her cheeks as she stepped out of the car. She took a slow breath and walked across the gravel path, every step rehearsed in her mind. Then she saw him. Daniel was already there, speaking with the library director beneath the soft glow of the hanging lights. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, no tie, but still impossibly put together. His posture was its own kind of armor measured, still commanding. Yet when he turned and saw her approaching, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. There was no widening of eyes, no cinematic pause, just a slight pull at the corner of his mouth, a breath he forgot to finish, and the briefest flicker of surprise in his usually unreadable expression. Grace noticed, and for the first time since this arrangement began, she didn't feel like an employee or a favor. She felt seen. Daniel walked over, his footsteps crunching lightly on the gravel. Without a word, he offered her his arm. She took it. The evening unfolded in practiced politeness. They smiled for pictures. Daniel introduced her to a few board members as his fiancée, and Grace found herself nodding, laughing in all the right places. They told the same story twice, how they'd met in New York, how they reconnected when Daniel returned home. She wondered, briefly, if he had rehearsed it, or if it was simply easy for him to sound sincere when he wasn't. Later, when the small band began playing and a few couples drifted to the lawn to dance, Daniel turned to her. "Would you?" he asked, offering his hand. Grace hesitated, just for a second. Then she placed her hand in his. The music was soft and old standard, familiar but unintrusive. They moved slowly, gracefully. Daniel's hand rested lightly at her back, his other guiding hers with a quiet confidence. For the first few steps, Grace focused on not stepping on his shoes, but somewhere between the chorus and the hush of violin, her mind drifted. He was warm, not in temperature, but in presence. There was something different in the way he looked at her now. His gaze wasn't assessing or guarded. It was present, real. Grace found herself wondering what it might be like to stay in this moment longer than necessary, to pretend not just for the sake of appearances, but for something else, something unspoken, dangerous in its softness. And for a brief second, she saw it in him too. He looked at her as if the crowd had faded, as if he forgot it was all part of a deal, and she was more than a convenient cover story. But just as quickly, he pulled away just slightly, the pressure in his hand shifting, his jaw tightening. The song ended. He offered a small nod. "Thank you." She stepped back with a polite smile, but the silence between them felt heavier than the night air. Grace moved toward the refreshment table to collect herself. She poured a small cup of cider and took a slow sip, letting the warmth settle her nerves. Around her, voices murmured, the pleasant din of polite society. Then she heard it, two women talking just a few feet behind her, their tone hushed but pointed. "I heard she left him at the altar." "No, really ran off with someone else. The photographer, I think, happened years ago, but he's never been the same. Poor Nora. She was so proud of that wedding, invited half the town." Grace froze, her hand tightening around the cup. She didn't need to guess who they were talking about. She set the cider down and turned to scan the crowd. Daniel stood alone near the edge of the lawn, speaking to the mayor, but his expression was distant, as if he wasn't really hearing a word. Grace felt something shift in her chest. Not pity, something deeper. Recognition. Maybe understanding. He had been hurt, deeply, and suddenly, all his precision, all his silence, all his cold professionalism, none of it looked like arrogance anymore. It looked like armor. Later, as the crowd began to thin and the band packed up their instruments, Grace stood beside him near the library steps. He didn't speak, just looked out at the flickering lanterns and the town he used to call home. She thought about asking him, about the wedding, the woman who left, the cracks in his carefully laid facade, but she didn't, not yet. Instead, she simply said, "Thank you for asking me to be here." He nodded. "You did well tonight." She didn't know whether to feel complimented or dismissed. Still, as they walked to the car, a question settled quietly in her heart, not about the arrangement, not about the fundraiser, but about the man walking beside her, and why someone who carried so much still chose to carry it alone. She told herself it was all pretend. but her heart wasn't listening anymore. It started as a simple task. Daniel asked her to help clear out the old records room tucked behind the original office wing. The storage space hadn't been touched in years, and it showed. Dust clung to the window panes. Boxes leaned against each other like tired dancers who had forgotten their steps. They were only supposed to sort through old permits, file duplicates, and discard outdated forms. Grace wore jeans and an old cardigan, expecting nothing more than a quiet evening of paper cuts and stale air. Daniel arrived in a rolled-up dress shirt and sleeves dusted with chalk from one of the ancient file cabinets. He didn't speak much, just gestured toward a pile and said, "That one's next." An hour passed. Maybe more. The rhythm of silence between them felt almost natural now, less awkward, more familiar. They moved like two people who didn't need small talk to fill the space. There was a kind of peace in it, until the lights went out. A soft pop. Then darkness. Grace froze, fingers still in the filing drawer. Did we trip a breaker? Daniel exhaled, low and calm. Old wiring. It happens. She heard him rummage around, then the spark of a match. A moment later, the glow of a single candle lit the room, casting long shadows along the boxes and across his face. He set it in a small ceramic mug and placed it on the nearest shelf. Grace smiled faintly. "That's almost romantic." He glanced at her, one eyebrow slightly raised, but said nothing. They sat for a while, the work forgotten. The room was quiet except for the distant ticking of a clock on the hallway wall and the occasional rustle of leaves outside the window. Then, unexpectedly, Daniel spoke. "My mother used to keep candles like this in the kitchen," said it made the house feel less lonely. Grace turned slightly, listening. She hated overhead lighting, said it was too harsh. She liked soft things, old linens, lemon tea, faded books with loose bindings. His voice wasn't sad, just far away. She believed there was goodness in quiet places, that you could find truth in the ordinary if you paid attention. Grace looked at him carefully, her heart suddenly too tender. "She sounds like someone I would have liked." Daniel gave a small nod. "You would have." The candle flickered, casting gold across his cheekbones and the bridge of his nose. He looked different in this light, less like a man who controlled everything, and more like someone still learning how to let go. Grace pulled her knees up to her chest, resting her chin lightly. "My dad used to fall asleep in his armchair with the TV on mute," said the quiet let him think more clearly. Daniel smiled just barely. "Sounds familiar." They sat like that, side by side on the old rug, the candle between them. Time felt suspended. Neither one of them moved. The room seemed to hold its breath. At one point, their hands touched briefly, his fingertips brushing the back of hers as he reached for another box. Grace didn't pull away. He didn't either. Something stirred, something real. And in that quiet moment, candlelight soft. World hushed. Grace felt herself leaning in. Just a little. Not dramatically, not like in movies, just an unconscious drift toward warmth. Daniel met her halfway, almost. He stopped, pulled back. The air shifted. He stood quickly, dusting off his pants, his face unreadable. "We should finish this tomorrow." Grace blinked, grounding herself back in the moment, her breath catching in her throat. "Okay?" He didn't look at her again. Just reached for the box near the door, grabbed his coat, and left with a quiet, "Good night." The door clicked behind him. Grace sat in the half-dark room, the candle still burning low beside her. She stared at it, the flame now swaying as if it too felt the sudden chill. She pressed her fingers to her lips, not because they had kissed, but because they hadn't. And yet, it felt like they had. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Grace lay in bed, the ceiling fan circling overhead like a slow, heavy thought. She tried to read, then tried to write a list of errands, then tried to count backwards from 100. But nothing quieted her mind, because something had happened in that room. And it wasn't the light or the dust or even the closeness. It was the way her heart had answered before her logic could speak. She reminded herself it was pretend. All of it, a deal, a performance, temporary, but no matter how many times she repeated it, her chest still ached in a way that didn't feel like acting. She never meant to fall in love, but when she said the words, she meant them with everything she had left. It was raining again, the kind of soft, steady rain that didn't ask to be noticed, just quietly filled the air and clung to windows like memories too gentle to brush away. Grace stood in the hallway outside Daniel's office, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her cardigan. She had spent all day trying to forget the look in his eyes the night before, how he had pulled away when closeness had almost undone him. But forgetting hadn't worked. She hadn't planned to fall for him. Not the way he moved through a room. Not the way he held silence like it was a second language. Not the quiet grief she saw behind his steady hands. But love doesn't wait for permission, and hers had already taken root. She knocked softly. Daniel looked up from the paperwork spread across his mother's old writing desk. He looked tired, not in the usual way, but like someone who hadn't let themselves feel anything in a very long time. "Do you have a minute?" she asked. He nodded once. "Of course." She stepped in slowly, her heartbeat matching the quiet tick of the antique clock behind him. "I've been thinking," she began, voice careful but steady, "about what we're doing. This arrangement?" He leaned back slightly. "If you want to end it, I understand." Grace shook her head. "That's not what I want." Silence. She stepped closer, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the desk. "When we started this, I told you there would be no emotions, that it was just a role I agreed to play." He looked at her, his expression unreadable, but somewhere along the way, she continued. It stopped being pretend. At least for me. There it was, laid bare in the soft space between them. Daniel looked down at the ring on her hand, the thin band of silver that symbolized a lie too close to the truth. "I care about you," she said, barely above a whisper. "More than I should. More than I meant to." Still, he said nothing. Her heart pounded. "I'm not asking for anything. I couldn't keep pretending." Daniel stood slowly, not abruptly, not with anger, but with a kind of heaviness that made the room feel smaller. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low, "but that's not something I can give you." Grace blinked, her breath catching. "Why?" He turned away, one hand running through his hair. "Because it's not safe. Because every time I've let someone close, it's ended with me alone in the aftermath." She stepped toward him. "I'm not her, Daniel." He closed his eyes. "That doesn't matter. The damage was done long before you." The ache in her chest was no longer subtle. It roared in her ears. "You say you can't feel," she said, her voice trembling now. "But that's not true. I've seen it, in the way you look at me, in the way you almost let go." He didn't move. "I'm not asking for forever," she whispered. "Just a chance. But I can't keep standing here if you won't even try." Daniel finally looked at her, and for a brief second, his eyes were glassy haunted. "I can't," he said again. Grace nodded, slowly. Her face was calm, but her fingers curled tightly into her palm. She reached down, slipped the ring from her finger, and placed it gently on the desk. No grand speech, no last plea, just silence. She turned and walked out, the soft sound of her footsteps trailing like a fading heartbeat down the hall. That night, Daniel didn't go home. He stayed in the office long after the rain stopped, seated at his mother's desk, the same desk where she used to write Christmas cards and budget recipes with pencil and lined paper. The room was quiet except for the occasional creak of old wood and the distant hum of a streetlight flickering outside. He picked up the ring she had left behind. It was small, simple, nothing grand or flashy, but it had weight now. He rolled it slowly between his fingers, staring at the empty space where her hand used to be. Part of him had expected this, had known it would come, but the moment had arrived sooner than he was ready for. And now, the silence wasn't peaceful. It was hollow. He rested his elbows on the desk, buried his face in his hands, and exhaled the kind of breath that only comes when something inside finally breaks. For the first time in years, he wished someone were there to tell him what to do, but Grace was gone, and the only thing she'd left behind was the truth he wasn't brave enough to keep. Some things echo louder in silence, like the sound of footsteps that no longer come home. The office hadn't changed. The desk was still spotless. The hallway still carried the faint scent of cedar and old files. But everything Daniel touched now felt foreign, as if the air itself had shifted since she left. It had been 3 days. 3 days since Grace placed the ring gently on the desk and walked out without looking back. 3 days of answering no calls, hearing no keys in the lock, and listening to the echo of silence where laughter used to live. Daniel tried to lose himself in reports, budgets, memos, but his focus fractured, scattered across the hours like broken glass on hardwood. Nothing felt urgent anymore. Nothing felt like enough. Even his coffee tasted different, bland, bitter, missing that odd touch of cinnamon Grace sometimes added when she brewed it early. She'd never told him why, only said it reminded her of home. Now, every corner of the building reminded him of her. The note still sat on his calendar. Don't forget, call Mrs. Langford about her missing invoice. Be kind. She's 82. The paper was creased from where he'd unfolded it 3 times that morning, just to see her handwriting. At lunchtime, he walked into the break room and opened the cabinet where Grace kept her favorite tea, chamomile with dried orange peel. 1 bag left. He didn't drink it, just stared at it for a long while. The light above the back hallway flickered. He walked over, out of habit, and switched it off. Grace had always turned it on around dusk, said it made the office feel less lonely after hours. Now the hallway looked darker than he remembered. At home. The silence deepened. Her mug was still on the counter, rinsed, turned upside down to dry. The blanket she used on the sofa still hung over the edge, folded unevenly like she always left it. Daniel sat down at the kitchen table that night, his dinner untouched. He looked around at the space they once shared, half in shadow, half in memory, and suddenly realized he had started counting her absences. Not just the physical ones, but the ways she had softened the edges of his life. When she was here, the world seemed quieter, less harsh, as if she filtered out the noise with nothing more than her presence. Now that she was gone, everything was louder. The ticking of the old wall clock, the hum of the refrigerator, even his own breathing. He hadn't known how much space she filled until she wasn't filling it anymore. The next morning, Daniel arrived at the office early. He didn't know why. There was no meeting, no schedule, just restlessness, an ache that didn't leave. On his desk sat a thick white envelope, no return address, just his name written in the slanted cursive of someone he hadn't seen in over a year. His mother's handwriting. His breath caught. He sat down slowly, the chair creaking beneath him. He turned the envelope over and saw the note attached. To be opened only when you can't hear me anymore. He stared at the words for a long time. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges, like it had waited too long to be read. He wondered how it had ended up here, today, of all days. Perhaps her lawyer had held on to it, or maybe it had simply gotten lost in the shuffle of estate documents. He broke the seal. Inside was a letter, 3 pages, folded neatly. The top line read in familiar script, "My sweet boy. If you're reading this, you're grieving something you don't know how to name." Daniel closed his eyes. She always had a way of getting to the heart of things without asking for permission. He read on, the words pulling him under like slow-moving water. "I watched you build walls taller than any building you ever owned. I understood why. The world has not always been kind, but love is not built behind walls. My darling, it lives in windows you leave open, in the hands you reach for, even when you're afraid." His throat tightened. "You may think you're protecting yourself, but I see it more clearly now. You're not guarding your heart, you're hiding from it." He read the line twice, then a third time. She had written this before she was gone, and yet it felt like she had written it this morning. Daniel let the pages rest in his lap as he leaned back, staring at the ceiling, feeling more than just the weight of loss. He felt the weight of choice. He had let Grace go not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much. And somehow, in his twisted logic, he believed that made him dangerous. But now, maybe dangerous wasn't the word. Maybe it was cowardice. He looked down at the final paragraph of the letter. If you ever find someone who brings you peace, don't run from it. Run toward it, even if it scares you. Especially if it scares you. He folded the letter slowly. Then he stood. He didn't know where she was, but he had to find her. Because suddenly, the ring wasn't the only thing she had left behind. She had left behind a life that might still be waiting for him, if he could find the courage to return to it. Sometimes, it takes the voice of the dead to make the living finally feel. Daniel had always thought himself prepared for grief. He'd buried it, shelved it, polished it into silence. But now, with the pages of his mother's letter laid open across the oak desk, he felt it raw, immediate, unfiltered. Her words didn't accuse. They didn't beg. They simply saw him, every corner of him, every brick he had stacked around his heart. And they told him, gently but firmly, that he had built the wrong kind of empire. You can build towers, Daniel, she had written. You can rebuild cities, but none of it will matter if there's no light on in the kitchen when you come home. You'll die surrounded by marble and glass, but not love. He sat in silence, the letter trembling in his hands. Then he cried, not the dignified kind of grief, the one you wipe away quickly behind closed doors, but the heaving, shoulders shaking kind, the kind that cracked something open, the kind that hadn't found a way out in years. Tears dropped onto the edge of the letter, bleeding the ink just slightly. He didn't try to stop them. When the wave finally passed, he remained still, his breathing uneven but steadying. He wiped his face with the sleeve of his shirt, then looked up at the house he had once called sanctuary. It felt hollow now, too clean, too quiet. He wandered through it slowly, past the unused guest room, the spare toothbrush still in the drawer from when Grace had stayed that weekend. Worried about a snowstorm, the spot on the hallway floor where she had tripped once, barefoot and half laughing, the chipped mug she used every morning without fail. No matter how many new ones he offered, he paused in the doorway of the kitchen. The light flicked on with a soft hum, bathing the room in its usual golden glow. And for the first time, he hated it, because it no longer welcomed anyone home. Daniel sat down at the kitchen table. He folded the letter slowly, like something sacred, and tucked it back into the envelope. Then he stood. That night, he logged into the private server that held all his company records. He began the process of resigning, not just stepping down, but selling his stake, selling the illusion, selling the version of himself that had spent a lifetime winning boardrooms and losing everything else. By midnight, the contracts were in motion. By 1 a.m., the suitcase was packed. He placed the envelope in the inner pocket of his coat, next to the only other item he was bringing from the life he was leaving behind. The silver engagement ring Grace had once slipped off her finger and set down without a word. Now he carried it like an apology. By morning, he was at her old building. The Vermont air was sharp, biting at his lungs, but he barely felt it. He rang the buzzer, heart pounding. A minute passed, then 2. Finally, the door creaked open. A woman, late 60s, floral apron, hair pinned in a neat bun, peered out. "You look lost, sweetheart," she said kindly. Daniel cleared his throat. "I'm looking for Grace Bennett. She used to live here." The woman gave him a long, thoughtful glance, then nodded slowly. "She did. Sweet girl. Moved out a couple weeks ago." His heart dropped. "Do you know where she went?" The woman hesitated, then said, "She mentioned something about going back home. Said her brother needed her. Montana, I think. Out near Whitefish." Daniel exhaled, quiet but firm. "Thank you." She tilted her head. "If you find her, tell her Mrs. Ames says hello, and that her lemon muffins still haven't been beaten." He offered a faint smile, grateful, and turned back toward the car. The highway stretched out before him, gray ribbon winding through morning mist. flanked by pine and fog. He didn't check his phone. He didn't make a plan. He just drove. With every mile, the world he'd built receded in the rearview mirror, and ahead, somewhere in the wide, open quiet of Montana, was the woman he had finally found the courage to follow. He left the city for love, but when he saw her again, she looked like someone who had already let go. Snow was falling gently over the porch roof as Daniel pulled up to the small farmhouse. The Montana sky hung low and pale, brushed in the soft gray of winter. Pines stood like sentinels at the edge of the field, and smoke curled up from a chimney that looked worn by time and memories. He stepped out of the car, unsure of his own breath. The ring felt heavy in his coat pocket, colder than the wind that brushed his face. The wood beneath his boots creaked with each step across the porch. He raised his hand, paused, then knocked once, twice, then a third time that barely made a sound. The door opened slowly. Grace stood there, wrapped in a thick cardigan, hair tied back in a loose knot. She looked older somehow, not in years, but in weight. The kind life puts on your shoulders when you've had to carry more than your share. Her eyes widened, then narrowed. "What are you doing here?" Her voice wasn't angry, but it wasn't welcoming either. It carried that quiet edge of someone who had waited too long for something that never came and had taught herself to stop hoping. Daniel swallowed. His mouth was dry, and he hadn't planned a speech. "I needed to see you," he said softly, "to tell you things I should have said a long time ago." Grace stood still. She didn't ask him in. She didn't shut the door either. That, he thought, was something. "I read a letter," he said, his voice steadier now, "from my mother. After she passed, she saw through me more than I ever wanted to admit." He paused, the wind shifting behind him. A gust carried a few snowflakes through the space between them, and he watched one land on her shoulder and melt. She reminded me that love isn't about protection. It's about presence, about showing up even when you're scared. Grace's gaze didn't waver. "I wasn't just scared of loving you," he continued. "I was scared of being loved by you. Because the last time I let someone in, she left me at the altar. I stood in front of 100 people with vows I never got to say, and I told myself that love was the risk, that if I could just control everything, I'd never feel that hollow again." His hand was still in his coat pocket, fingers curling around the velvet box. But he didn't take it out. "I hurt you," he said quietly, "because I was still bleeding from something I never faced." Grace exhaled, her voice low. "You didn't just hurt me, Daniel. You made me believe I imagined everything, every smile, every quiet moment. Like it didn't mean anything. It meant everything," he said, almost pleading. "I just didn't know how to hold it without breaking it." She looked away, toward the trees, toward the pale blur of the barn roof in the distance. Anywhere but at him. "I'm not asking you to forgive me tonight," he said. "I'm not asking for anything. Really." She turned back slowly, unsure. "I came here because I realized I can build 100 companies, make 10,000 decisions a day, and none of it matters if I can't learn how to be present in one kitchen, one porch, one conversation with someone who still makes my heart stop." Her arms were crossed, sleeves pulled tight over her hands. She didn't speak. "I want to stay," he said. "Help with your brother, shovel snow, make terrible pancakes. I want to learn the things I never gave myself permission to want." He reached into his pocket, then paused. "I brought the ring, but I'm not here to propose. I'm here to earn the chance to one day deserve it." She blinked. The wind shifted again, softer this time. A flake landed on the step beside his shoe. The quiet stretched long and uncertain. Then, slowly, Grace stepped back, not far. Just enough. Enough for him to see that the door was no longer closed between them. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no, and that, for now, was enough. He used to manage millions. Now he was trying to cook scrambled eggs, without burning the pan. The sizzle was aggressive, too loud for something so soft. Daniel squinted at the skillet, wooden spoon in hand, eyebrows drawn tight like he was negotiating a hostile merger. The eggs stuck. The butter had browned too quickly, and the toast in the oven forgotten entirely. A puff of smoke rose behind him as the scent of something overdone drifted through the kitchen. Grace leaned in from the hallway, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Everything okay in here?" Daniel turned, sheepish. "Depends. Are fire alarms optional in Montana?" She chuckled, shaking her head. "You're getting better. Last week you didn't even use butter." "Progress," he muttered, flipping the eggs, half of which stayed behind, clinging to the pan in protest. It had been 3 weeks since he arrived, 3 weeks of mornings like this, imperfect, slow, strangely beautiful. Daniel had traded his polished shoes for thick wool socks and his conference calls for grocery runs. He drove Ethan to physical therapy twice a week, pushing the wheelchair gently over the uneven gravel, listening as the younger man rambled about guitars and wild dreams of opening a bakery one day. In the afternoons, he swept the front porch, folded laundry with more focus than finesse, and learned very slowly that tea should not be steeped for 12 minutes. Nor should you use dish soap in a dishwasher. Grace never mocked him, not directly. But she laughed genuinely, softly when he sprinkled too much cinnamon on the applesauce, or mistook powdered sugar for flour. That laughter was different now, not cautious like before, just cautious enough. She hadn't said she loved him, and he hadn't said it, either. But something was shifting, tangibly, like the way she let him brush past her in the kitchen without moving away, or how she left him little notes by the fridge. "Don't forget Ethan's 11, or tea's in the blue tin now." No declarations, just presence. One evening, after a quiet dinner, Daniel found himself alone on the porch. The snow had melted into soft patches, revealing the early stirrings of earth beneath. The stars blinked above him, closer here, it seemed, than they ever were in Vermont. He sat on the creaky swing bench, an old quilt draped over his shoulders, fingers clasped around a chipped mug. And then he spoke, not loudly, not even consciously. "If Mom could see me now," he said into the night air, "she'd probably drop her knitting and laugh for a good 5 minutes." He exhaled through a half smile. "She always said love shows up in the mess. The dropped keys, the burned toast, the late night stories. And I thought she meant everyone else, that I'd just be the one building walls while watching others fall in love." The wind stirred slightly, cold against his cheeks. "But here I am," he whispered, trying not to burn eggs and folding dish towels with uneven corners. "And somehow, this matters more than anything I ever signed my name to." Behind him, the screen door creaked open. He turned, startled, but Grace just stood there, 2 mugs in her hands, steam curling up from both. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, softly, "You left the cinnamon out again." He laughed quietly, heart lightening. She walked over, handed him 1 mug, and sat beside him. The porch creaked again, a gentle rhythm beneath them. Together, they watched the stars, the quiet between them finally feeling like peace, not distance. It was never the ring that made it real. It was the man who finally came back for it. The snow that morning was soft, less like a storm, more like a quiet blessing from the sky. It drifted gently over the fields, collecting on the wooden railing of the front porch, frosting the window panes in delicate lace. Grace had just finished folding a fresh pile of laundry socks paired neatly, towels warm from the dryer when she heard the knock. Not on the front door, but a tap on the glass just outside the kitchen. She turned. Daniel was standing out on the porch, bundled in his old gray coat, the one she'd stitched a button back onto last week. His breath clouded the air as he waited, still, hands deep in his pockets. There was something about the way he stood, not tense, not nervous, just quiet, settled, like he'd come to terms with something before ever asking for it. She opened the door slowly. "It's cold," she said softly. "You'll catch I need to do this out here." He interrupted gently. Then, from his coat pocket, he pulled out a small, familiar box. Nothing fancy, no velvet, Just the same weathered case she remembered placing on the hallway table months ago. I kept it, he said. The ring. Not because I thought you'd change your mind, but because I knew I needed to. He opened the box, and there it was, the simple gold band, slightly dulled at the edges, still holding every memory it ever carried. I bought this ring when I thought I needed someone to help me look the part, he continued. But now, I want you to have it because you're the only thing that ever felt real. Grace stood in the doorway, one hand clutching the frame for balance, not because she was swaying, but because her heart was. Daniel took a slow breath, then knelt down on one knee. Not for show. Not for drama, but because some things just needed to be said from the ground up. I don't want the kind of life that runs on schedules and silence anymore, he said. I don't want to wake up wondering if I chose the right profit margin or closed the right deal. I want to wake up and wonder if we're out of tea, if we need more cinnamon, if Ethan's appointment is at 10 or 11. Snow landed in his hair, melting against the warmth of his skin. I want the little things. Grace, the boring, beautiful, everyday things. With you. He looked up at her, eyes clear, not pleading, not afraid, just present. Grace opened her mouth, closed it, and then slowly stepped forward, letting the door swing gently behind her. Her eyes shimmered, but not a single tear fell. She knelt beside him, not out of politeness, not out of drama, but because it felt wrong to be standing above someone who had just offered her everything. She took the box from his hand, not the ring, just the box, opened it, looked at it, then she looked at him. I don't need a perfect life, she whispered, but I need a real one, with someone who's willing to stay when it gets hard. I'm staying, he said, voice low. She didn't say yes. She didn't have to. She reached out, took his hand, and slipped her fingers between his. Her thumb brushed the side of his palm, where it had been shaking just slightly, and stilled it. They stayed there, on the porch, in the snow, for a long moment that didn't need filling. Then, wordlessly, she stood and gently tugged his hand. He followed, back into the warmth of the house, past the half-folded towels, the chipped mug on the counter, the smell of cinnamon faint from yesterday's apple pie. And when the door closed behind them with a soft click, it wasn't a sound of finality. It was the sound of something finally coming home. It wasn't the size of the house. It was the fact that someone left the porch light on. They could have moved into the Hawthorne estate, a vast stretch of windows, marble floors, and rooms that echoed when no one was speaking. It had all the markings of wealth, of success. But Daniel didn't hesitate when he offered a different idea. The old house, he said quietly, as they drove back toward Vermont. My mother's, the one with the creaky floorboards and that cracked back step. Grace turned her head toward him, watching his profile against the fading light. He wasn't the same man she met months ago, not anymore. His edges had softened, but his presence had grown deeper. That house, she whispered, the one with the yellow door. Daniel smiled. That's the one. Spring in Vermont was shy. It crept in slowly, brushing past the last patches of snow, sneaking between shutters, peeking into quiet rooms. They arrived in the early morning. The house stood waiting. Quiet, but not empty. It had known laughter and loss, tea shared in sorrow, and sunlight that filtered through sheer curtains in a way that made even silence feel safe. They didn't move in with fanfare. No trucks, no announcements, just two people with a few boxes and the weight of knowing exactly what they wanted this time. The house needed work, nothing urgent, but just enough to make them feel like they were building something together. Daniel replaced the back step first. It groaned in protest, but finally gave way to new wood. Grace painted the door again, still yellow, but warmer, more golden. She planted hydrangeas under the kitchen window, the way his mother used to. In the evenings, they found a rhythm. Daniel learned to make coffee the way Grace liked, strong but not bitter, with a dash of oat milk and exactly 1 spoon of honey. Every morning, he left it on the side table by her reading chair before she came downstairs. She, in turn, baked lemon shortbread, once a week, his mother's recipe. A little too crumbly, but just sweet enough to keep the memory alive. They didn't talk about forever every day. They didn't need to. Instead, they filled the hours with small things, Sunday crossword puzzles, joint trips to the farmer's market, old records playing softly while they worked on fixing the roof gutters or reorganizing the kitchen drawers. One evening, after a long day planting seedlings along the fence, Daniel stood at the stove, poking gently at a pot of vegetable stew. The kitchen smelled of rosemary and garlic. Grace was curled on the window seat nearby, legs tucked beneath her, a book open but unread. The golden hour filtered through the trees, spilling across the floor, casting shadows that danced with the steam rising from the pot. Daniel looked over at her and smiled. "Still awake?" he asked. She turned a page she hadn't read. "Barely. But I like this part of the day." He nodded. "Me too." She closed the book, set it aside, and watched him stir. "You've changed," she said softly. He looked up, one eyebrow raised. "You cook now?" she teased. He laughed, putting the spoon down. "It's either that or your brother keeps making grilled cheese for every meal." They shared a look full of comfort, of shared memories that no longer ached. Grace stood and walked over, sliding her arms gently around his waist. "I think your mom would have liked this version of you," she said into his back. Daniel stilled for a moment, then turned, resting his forehead lightly against hers. "I like this version of me," he whispered, "because I get to come home to this." The porch light had been broken when they moved in. One night, Grace found an old fixture in the attic a little rusty, but charming. Daniel spent the next 2 days rewiring it, despite never having done electrical work before. When he flipped the switch and the soft amber glow spilled across the front steps, Grace clapped like a child, and from that night on, the light was always on. Not out of habit, but because it meant someone was always waiting. That home wasn't just a place, it was a promise. They invited the neighbors over for a small dinner in early May. Nothing fancy roast chicken, fresh bread, and laughter that filled every room. An elderly woman who'd known Daniel's mother hugged Grace at the door as she left. "She'd be proud of you too," she said, eyes kind and shining. "This house hasn't felt this alive in years." That night, after the guests left and the last plate was rinsed, Grace walked out to the porch, wrapped in a quilt. She sat on the swing, her favorite mug warm in her hands. Daniel joined her a moment later. They sat in silence for a while. Then she looked at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "From desk to destiny." He turned to her. "What?" She smiled, gaze lost somewhere in the trees. "It's what I would have titled our story. If this were a book..." Daniel leaned back against the railing, grinning. "A boring one," he teased. "No action, just burnt toast, broken porch lights, and a man who didn't know how to steep tea." She chuckled. "Maybe, but I'd read it over and over." He reached for her hand, squeezed it gently, and inside, through the window, the hallway glowed, not because it needed to, but because someone had left the light on. Love doesn't always arrive with fireworks or grand speeches. Sometimes, it shows up quietly through a cup of tea made just right, a porch light left on, or a heart finally brave enough to speak. This story reminds us that second chances don't come wrapped in perfection. They come in the form of people willing to grow, to apologize, and to show up every single day not with promises, but with presence. Daniel and Grace teach us that healing is not about forgetting the past, but learning to live beyond it, together. For those who've loved and lost, who carry wounds from years ago, this is a gentle nudge. You're never too old to start again. You're never too late to forgive or be forgiven. And sometimes, what we call the end is really just a doorway to a quieter, deeper kind of happiness. So, leave the porch light on. Someone might be finding their way back, or maybe it's time you do, too. Thank you for spending your time with us today. If this story touched your heart, reminded you of something true, or simply brought a quiet moment of reflection, we're grateful you stayed until the end. Please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel. It helps us continue to bring you stories that heal, inspire, and remind us of what truly matters.